The wind that howls through the pass of Thermopylae carries a specific weight. It is the weight of silence where once there was the din of dying men, the snapping of spears, and the roar of a king who refused to kneel. In 480 BC, 300 Spartiates, alongside their Thespian and Theban allies, bought Greece time with their blood. But time is a neutral resource. It favors only those who use it to sharpen their blades. Picture the scene in the months following that sacrifice. The Persian Empire, a colossus stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, believed the war was won. Athens was a smoking ruin, its temples toppled, its olive groves burned to ash. Xerxes, the king of kings, had retired to Asia, leaving behind his finest general, Mardonius, and the very cream of the imperial army. They were confident, battle-hardened, and numerically superior. They believed the spirit of Greece had died with Leonidas. But here is what the chronicles often gloss over in favor of the tragedy at the Hot Gates. Thermopylae was not a defeat. It was a down payment. The gold used to pay that debt with Spartan iron, and the collection date was set for the following summer on the dusty plains of Platea. This was not merely a battle for territory. It was a war of extermination. The Spartans were not marching to defend a border. They were marching to butcher the men who had killed their king. The year is 479 BC. The heat in Boeotia is oppressive, a shimmering haze that distorts the horizon. On one side of the Asopus River sits the Persian war machine. Modern estimates suggest Mardonius commanded perhaps 80,000 to 120,000 troops, though ancient sources inflate this into the millions. Regardless of the exact count, they were the Immortals, the Sacans, the Bactrians, and the Medes, the lethal tip of the Achaemenid spear. They had constructed a massive fortified camp, a wooden city of war, teeming with cavalry and archers who could darken the sun. Facing them was the largest Greek army ever assembled. For the first time, the fractious city-states had truly united. There were Athenians, Corinthians, Megarians, and Tegeans. But the spine of this beast, the terrifying weight of its center, was Sparta. Pausanias, the regent of Sparta and nephew of the fallen Leonidas, led them. He brought not 300, but 5,000 Spartiates, the full citizen levy. Beside them marched 5,000 Perioiko and 35,000 Helots. This was the full might of Lacedaemon, a sight never seen before and never to be seen again. The atmosphere in the Greek camp was a cocktail of anxiety and cold rage. They were terrified of the Persian cavalry, and rightly so. The memory of how easily horsemen could cut down light infantry was fresh. Pausanias knew that to descend onto the flat plain was suicide. He kept his forces in the foothills of Mount Cithaeron, using the rough terrain to neutralize the Persian horses. It was a stalemate, a staring contest between two predators waiting for the other to flinch. But Mardonius was not a man of patience. He needed to crush the Greeks before their alliance fractured from within. He launched his cavalry, led by the flamboyant commander Mecistius, to harass the Greek lines. Picture the chaos. Thousands of horsemen wheeling and firing, clouds of dust choking the hoplites, the stinging bite of arrows finding the gaps in bronze armor. The Greeks were pinned, suffering under the relentless assault. Then, a moment of pure cinematic violence shifted the psychological landscape. The Megarian contingent was crumbling under the pressure. Pausanias sent 300 elite Athenians to their aid. In the melee, a lucky arrow struck the horse of Mecistius. The beast reared, throwing the Persian commander to the rocky ground. The Athenians rushed him. Mecistius was a giant of a man, clad in gold-scale armor under a scarlet tunic. Blades rang off his armor, useless against the high-quality metal, until a soldier drove a spike through his eye. The roar that went up from the Greek lines wasn't just a cheer. It was a release of pressure. They dragged the body of Mecistius along the lines on a cart. The Persians, seeing their beloved commander dead, wailed so loudly that Herodotus tells us the sound echoed off the mountains like thunder. This was the first cut. The Greeks realized these demigods could bleed, but Mardonius was far from beaten. He poisoned the Gargantuan spring, the only water source for the Greek army, and his archers cut off the supply trains coming through the mountain passes. Pausanias was now in a crisis. His army was thirsty, starving, and under constant bombardment. He made a decision that nearly cost him the war, yet accidentally set the stage for victory. He ordered a night retreat. The plan was to move the army back to a position known as the island near the city of Platea, where they would have access to water and protection from the cavalry. It was a sound tactical move, but in the fog of war, execution is everything. And here is where the famed Spartan discipline cracked, revealing the stubborn pride that defined their culture. The maneuver was to happen in total silence, under the cover of darkness. The center of the Greek line, comprised of smaller allies, panicked. They didn't just retreat. They ran all the way to the walls of Platea, leaving a massive gap in the line. The Athenians moved correctly, but blindly. The Spartans, however, didn't move at all. This brings us to one of the most incredible moments of insubordination in military history. Amophoridas, a captain of the Pitnate battalion, refused the order to retreat. He picked up a heavy rock with both hands, threw it at the feet of Pausanias, and declared that he would not bring shame upon Sparta by running from the barbarians. Imagine the tension. The sun is rising. The enemy is waking up. And the Spartan commander is arguing with his own subordinate while the rest of the army is scattering. Pausanias was furious, but he could not leave his men behind. The argument wasted hours. By the time Pausanias finally convinced the column to move, leaving Amophoridas no choice but to follow or die alone, the sun had crested the mountains. The retreat was botched. The Greek army was fragmented, spread out over miles of broken terrain. The Athenians were lost in the valley. The allies were cowering by the city. And the Spartans were caught in the open, strung out in a marching column, retreating uphill. Mardonius saw this from across the river. He didn't see a tactical maneuver. He saw a rout. He saw fear. He believed the Greeks were fleeing. They are running away. He shouted to his commanders. Abandoning his careful plans, he ordered a general advance. This wasn't a formed battle line. It was a chaotic rush to run down a fleeing enemy. The Persians crossed the Asopus, a screaming tide of humanity, eager to butcher the backs of the Spartans. But Mardonius made the fatal mistake of confusing a withdrawal with a retreat. He forgot who he was chasing. As the Persian cavalry crashed into the rear of the Spartan column, Pausanias halted. He sent a runner to the Athenians begging for aid, but the Athenians were already engaged with the pro-Persian Greeks. The Spartans were alone. 50,000 Persians were bearing down on 10,000 Lacedaemonians and Tegeans. What happened next is a testament to the iron-willed discipline that the Lycurgan laws instilled in Spartan men. They did not charge. They did not run. They formed a phalanx, locked their shields, and stood still. The Persian archers planted their wicker shields in the ground, forming a wall, and unleashed a storm of arrows. The sky darkened. The arrows fell like iron rain, drumming against the bronze of the hoplite shields, piercing groins, throats, and feet. Men fell screaming, but the line did not break. Pausanias was in the center, surrounded by the priesthood. He was offering sacrifices to Hera, looking for a sign from the gods that they could attack. The omens were bad. The goats were slaughtered, the entrails examined, and the priests shook their heads. The gods were not with them, so the Spartans stood there. For minutes that must have felt like hours, they endured the arrow storm without raising a spear. They were dying in formation, obedient to their gods and their general. This is the psychological horror of ancient warfare that movies fail to capture. It is not just the clash of swords. It is the discipline to watch your brother take an arrow to the neck and not break rank to help him. It is the ability to hold your ground while death rains from the sky, waiting for a word that might never come. Many Spartans began to mutter, asking why they must die like cattle. But no one moved. Finally, as the Tegeans, unable to bear the punishment any longer, began to surge forward without orders, Pausanias looked up to the temple of Hera on the hillside. He wept, screaming a prayer to the goddess not to let the Greeks be destroyed. At that precise moment, the sacrifices turned favorable. The call went out. The high-pitched trill of the pipes cut through the din of battle. The command was given. The Spartan phalanx exploded into motion. This was not the slow plodding of tired men. This was a coiled spring released. They didn't run. They marched with a terrifying rhythmic cadence that shook the earth. The Persians, confident behind their wall of wicker shields, suddenly realized the nature of the beast they had awoken. The Spartans crashed into the Persian line with the force of a landslide. The push of pike, the aphismos, began. The Persian soldiers were brave. Let no one tell you otherwise. They grabbed the Spartan spears with their bare hands and snapped them. They drew daggers and rushed the shield wall. But courage cannot overcome physics. The Persians wore linen tunics and carried wicker shields. The Spartans were encased in bronze and carried oak shields faced with metal. It was a meat grinder. The Spartans used their short swords, the xiphos, to stab over the shield rims, hacking into the faces and necks of the enemy. Mardonius, seeing his line buckle, rode into the fray on a white charger, surrounded by his elite bodyguard of 1,000 immortals. This was the moment the battle turned. The fighting around the general was fierce. The Spartans were being pushed back by the sheer skill of the immortals. But then, a Spartan named Erimnestos picked up a jagged rock, a humble weapon for a legendary moment, and hurled it. The stone struck Mardonius on the head. The Persian commander crumpled from his horse. Before his guards could rescue him, the Spartan line surged forward, and Mardonius was trampled into the dust, his skull crushed, his ambitions ended in the mud of Boeotia. The news of Mardonius's death spread like a virus through the Persian ranks. The heart went out of them. The immortals fought to the last man to protect his body, but the levy troops, the conscripts from 100 conquered nations, broke and ran. The rout was absolute. They fled back across the river to their wooden fort, but the Spartans were not done. They were not interested in routing the enemy. They were interested in erasure. The Greeks pursued them to the fort. For a time, the Persians held the walls, raining down missiles. But then the Athenians arrived, experts in siege warfare. They breached the walls and the Greeks poured in. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Herodotus claims that of the 300,000 Persians, an exaggeration, but indicative of the scale, only 3,000 survived the slaughter. The narrow confines of the camp became a slaughterhouse. The ground turned to mud with blood. When the dust settled, the booty was incomprehensible. The Greeks found tents filled with gold and silver furniture, bowls of precious metals, and tapestries woven with gold thread. Pausanias walked into the tent of Mardonius. He saw the silken couches and the tables laden with a feast prepared for the victors. He laughed. He ordered his cooks to prepare a traditional Spartan meal, a black broth and hard bread. He placed the two meals side by side and called his commanders. "Look," Pausanias said, gesturing to the gold and the gruel. "Look at the folly of the Mede, who, having such luxury as this, came all this way to rob us of our poverty." It was the ultimate insult, a final declaration of moral superiority. The Spartans had not just defeated the Persians. They had exposed the hollowness of their conquest. The Battle of Plataea was the true end of the Persian wars. Thermopylae was the spark. Salamis was the wound, but Platea was the death blow. It proved that a free army fighting for their land and their laws could defeat a slave army fighting for a distant king. The Spartans had avenged Leonidas. They had taken the blood debt owed to them and extracted it with interest. But here is the moral lesson that echoes through the centuries, one we must not ignore. Platea was won not just by bravery, but by unity born of desperation. The Greeks were squabbling, divided, and chaotic right up until the moment the spears lowered. They were flawed. Pausanias was arrogant. The Athenians were difficult. The Spartans were stubborn. But when the existential threat loomed, they held the line. They realized that civilization is a fragile thing, maintained only by those willing to stand in the shield wall when the arrows block out the sun. The 300 at Thermopylae became legends because they died. The 10,000 at Platea became heroes because they lived to build the future. They remind us that while sacrifice is noble, victory is necessary. If you want to uncover more lost chapters of history, the battles that shaped the maps we read today, and the warriors who paid the price for civilization, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are marching into the past, one battlefield at a time. Join us.